universe, as it turned out, had a filing system. Not the elegant crystalline databases you might expect from advanced civilizations, but actual filing cabinets, albeit ones that existed in 17 dimensions and required a permit to access. The archivist had discovered this particular cosmic bureaucracy 3 weeks ago, when she'd received what could generously be called a subpoena, though it resembled more of a singing jellyfish that wouldn't stop humming. Legal terminology until she acknowledged receipt. Decade 847 Alpha Ridiculous, she muttered, examining the translucent document that hovered just above her palm. Regarding the estate of species designation human, Terrasol 3, extinct as of Standard Cycle 2847-3. Extinct. Such a clinical word for what had actually been a rather drawn-out affair, involving 3 separate plagues, 2 economic collapses, and one particularly unfortunate incident with a social media algorithm that convinced half the population that breathing was a government conspiracy. The Preservation Committee's headquarters existed in what used to be called folded space, though the archivist suspected that was just a polite way of saying we built our office in a place that gives organic beings migraines. The architecture seemed designed by someone who'd heard about angles but never actually seen one, and the waiting room featured chairs that actively judged your posture. Designation, human final, announced a voice that sounded like wind chimes having an argument. Please proceed to Chamber 7, Gamma, hopefully the last one. The archivist stood, brushing cosmic dust from her jacket, a garment that had somehow survived longer than her entire species. She'd found it in a thrift store in what used to be Detroit, back when Detroit existed, back when thrift stores existed, back when the concept of used clothing hadn't been replaced by material manifestation pods that could create perfectly fitted garments from ambient energy and mild disappointment. Chamber 7 Gamma turned out to be a spherical room populated by beings who looked like they'd been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on how many limbs were appropriate. The lead judge, or possibly the lead filing cabinet, it was hard to tell, introduced itself as Coordinator Zeph 9900-10. Actually quite pleasant once you get to know them. We have reviewed your species' cultural output, Zeph 9900 began, their voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much and wished they could unsee most of it. The committee has classified approximately 847 trillion individual works as hazardous cultural material, pending further review. Hazardous? The archivist raised an eyebrow, a gesture that caused several committee members to recoil. We're talking about books and movies, not plutonium. Books? Repeated another committee member, a crystalline entity that pulsed ominously, containing detailed instructions for behaviors that violate 17 known laws of physics and at least 4 that we're still discovering. Movies, added a third, who appeared to be made entirely of concerned mathematical equations that suggest reality is somehow negotiable. The archivist glanced around the chamber, noting how each alien seemed to lean away from her, as if she might spontaneously burst into song or, worse, start telling them about the power of friendship. You summoned me here to discuss human creativity, she said slowly. The last human in existence. To decide whether our stories should be, what? Deleted? Burned? Filed under Do Not Open? Contains feelings? The committee requires testimony, Zeph 9900 explained, shuffling through documents that existed in more colors than the archivist's eyes could process. Your species has produced cultural materials that suggest impossible outcomes, irrational motivations, and conclusions that ignore fundamental principles of causality. For example, the crystalline member chimed in, literally, we have discovered numerous instances of what your species termed happy endings. The way they said it made it sound like a war crime. Happy endings, the archivist repeated. Stories where problems resolve favorably despite statistical improbability, the mathematical entity clarified. Where individuals succeed against overwhelming odds through determination alone. Where love conquers death, justice prevails over power, and small acts of kindness reshape entire civilization. Right, the archivist said. And this is hazardous because... The committee exchanged glances, or whatever passed for glances among beings who experience light as a form of casual conversation. Because, Zeph 9900 said quietly, other species have begun to believe such things might be possible. The next morning, assuming morning meant anything in a place where time moved sideways and occasionally apologized for the inconvenience, the archivist found herself facing a new tribunal. This one had bothered to arrange itself in a more traditional courtroom setup, though the witness stand was made of crystallized quantum uncertainty and kept shifting between existing and not existing based on her confidence level. Exhibit A, declared Judge Vault 5. Infinitely disappointed, a being who resembled a disappointed filing cabinet crossed with a sea urchin. They materialized a holographic display containing what appeared to be every romance novel ever written. Your species created 2.7 million variations of what you term love stories. Each one violates basic biological compatibility protocols. You've got to be kidding me, the archivist said, squinting at the data stream. You're putting romance novels on trial? We are particularly concerned, interrupted prosecutor Klex, sound of legal concern, entity that communicated through interpretive light patterns, with a subset your species labeled enemies to lovers. The psychological prerequisites for such emotional transitions defy all known behavioral modeling. The archivist watched as the prosecution presented evidence. Thousands of books, where characters who started by trying to kill each other ended up exchanging wedding vows and adopting rescue dogs. She had to admit, when presented as data points rather than entertainment, it did look somewhat unhinged. Furthermore, Vault 5 continued, producing another holographic nightmare, we have catalogued 847,000 examples of what humans termed action movies. Each features protagonists surviving statistically impossible scenarios through unexplained competence and selective physics. The display showed compilation footage, heroes walking away from explosions in slow motion, protagonists hanging from helicopters with one hand while delivering witty one-liners, and at least 47 separate instances of someone defusing a bomb with exactly 1 second remaining on the timer. Your witness, the mathematical entity from yesterday, now serving as defense calculator Axiom Prime, projected a three-dimensional graph into the air. How do you explain this pattern of narrative dishonesty? Narrative dishonesty. The archivist leaned back in her chair, which immediately began analyzing her stress levels and offering meditation suggestions. You mean fiction? The thing that's supposed to be, fictional? Defendant. Judge Vault 5's voice crackled with barely contained bureaucratic fury. Your species has created entertainment that suggests problems can be solved through personal growth, that conflicts resolve through understanding, and that individual actions can meaningfully impact large-scale outcomes. Yes, the archivist said slowly, that's generally how stories work. But it's not how reality works, Prosecutor Klex flashed in agitated yellows and reds. Yet 17 different species have submitted formal complaints after exposure to human cultural materials. The Threxy Collective has experienced a 340% increase in requests for romantic partnerships despite being an asexual hive mind. The quantum lawyers of Sector 9 have begun questioning the fundamental nature of justice after watching your courtroom dramas. The mech emperor of the spiral arm, defense calculator Axiom Prime added mournfully, has started signing their official decrees with little hearts after discovering human greeting cards. The archivist blinked. Little hearts. Approximately 2.3 millimeters in diameter, Vault 5 confirmed grimly. Pink, with sparkles. Your Honor, the archivist said, fighting the urge to laugh. Are you seriously suggesting that human fiction is dangerous because it makes other species optimistic? By suggesting, Prosecutor Klex pulsed ominously, that your cultural output functions as a cognitive virus. Exposure leads to irrational beliefs about possibility, purpose, and personal agency. Species that have existed for millennia in stable hierarchical systems are suddenly questioning authority, pursuing individual fulfillment, and expressing dissatisfaction with predetermined outcomes. The crystalline monarchy of Vega 7, Judge Vault 5 continued, has experienced their first revolution in 40,000 years. The rebels cited your species' concept of teen dystopian novels as inspiration. They're calling themselves the Resistance, Axiom Prime added, somehow managing to sound scandalized despite being made of living mathematics. They've adopted leather jackets as ceremonial wear and refused to participate in the mandatory contentment rituals. The archivist sat quietly for a moment, processing the cosmic irony of her situation. Humanity had finally achieved what it had always dreamed of. Their stories had reached the stars, inspiring other civilizations to dream of better worlds. And apparently, this was considered a war crime. So let me understand this correctly, she said finally. You want to destroy human culture because it encourages hope. We want to contain it, Judge Vault 5 corrected, before it spreads further. Hope, as your species practiced it, is a dangerous delusion that interferes with efficient social organization. The archivist smiled, an expression that caused half the tribunal to instinctively activate their defense systems. Your Honor, I think you might want to hear what I have to say about that. Proceed with caution, Judge Vault 5 warned, though their voice carried the tremor of someone who suspected they were about to regret their life choices. The tribunal will permit a brief statement. Actually, the archivist said, standing up from her quantum uncertainty chair, I was thinking more of a demonstration. Prosecutor Klex immediately flashed alarm colors that hadn't been seen since the great bureaucratic panic of cycle 2156. Absolutely not. We cannot risk further contamination of tribunal personnel. Contamination? The archivist laughed, a sound that made defense calculator Axiom Prime perform several emergency calculations to ensure reality remained stable. You're afraid of a story? We are exercising appropriate precautions, Judge Vault 5 declared, though they were now surrounded by a protective energy field that hummed nervously. Human narrative constructs have proven unexpectedly virulent. Fine, the archivist said, settling back into her chair. Then I'll just tell you one. A simple one, nothing dangerous. She paused, watching as the tribunal members exchanged panic communications through frequencies that tasted like bureaucratic terror. Once upon a time. Stop! Axiom Prime shrieked, their mathematical form fragmenting briefly into constituent equations. That phrase. We have documented 47,000 instances of that exact opening. It precedes every known fairy tale in your database. Right, the archivist said cheerfully. Fairy tales, stories for children. How dangerous could they be? The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments before cosmic disasters. Judge Vault 5's energy field flickered with what could charitably be called deep existential concern. The committee has reviewed your fairy tales, they said slowly. Cinderella experienced a complete socio-economic transformation based on footwear compatibility. Snow White was resurrected through unsolicited romantic contact. Sleeping Beauty altered her entire life trajectory via unauthorized awakening. And Jack, Prosecutor Klex added, pulsing with scandalized reds, committed breaking and entering, theft and assault. Yet your narrative presents these actions as heroic because the victim was mean and very large. You miss the point entirely, the archivist said. They're not instruction manuals, they're about transformation, about the possibility that circumstances, no matter how dire, aren't permanent. Precisely our concern, Axiom Prime calculated grimly. Your species taught children that powerless individuals could reshape their circumstances through courage, cleverness, and moral conviction. We taught them hope, the archivist corrected. Same thing, Judge Vorth 5 said. Hope is the belief that current conditions are temporary and improvable. It's fundamentally destabilizing to social order. The archivist leaned forward, ignoring the way her movement made everyone else lean back. Let me tell you about a little girl who lived with people who treated her badly. She worked from dawn to dusk, never complained, and dreamed of attending one party, just one. Do not continue, Prosecutor Klex warned, but their light patterns had shifted from alarm to something approaching fascination. She had no money, no connections, no power. By every logical measure, she should have accepted her circumstances and lived quietly in servitude forever. Statistically accurate, Axiom Prime admitted reluctantly. But she didn't. The archivist's voice softened, becoming the kind of voice that had once read bedtime stories to sleepy children on a planet that no longer existed. She believed she deserved better, and when the opportunity came, even though it seemed impossible, even though it required magic, even though it was temporary, she seized it. The fairy godmother was a clear violation of conservation of energy, Judge Vorth 5 protested, but their voice lacked conviction. The fairy godmother was metaphor, the archivist said. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the universe conspires to reward genuine goodness. Sometimes, just sometimes, the powerless discover they had power all along. But the glass slipper, Axiom Prime began, was the only thing that could prove she was the person who'd danced with the prince. She'd transformed herself so completely that recognition required physical evidence. The shoe wasn't magic, it was proof that transformation had occurred. The tribunal sat in stunned silence, or floated, or existed in whatever configuration passed for stunned silence among their respective species. You see, the archivist continued, it's not about glass slippers or fairy godmothers or princes. It's about the radical notion that circumstances can change, that individuals matter, that kindness and courage have power. That's, Judge Vortfine's voice was barely a whisper, that's exactly what we're afraid of. The hegemony of Proxima Centauri, Prosecutor Klex said faintly, has begun teaching their young ones this story. Productivity in the labor sectors has decreased by 23% as workers have started demanding fair treatment and reasonable working conditions. The crystalline collective, Axiom Prime added, is experiencing what they're calling individual identity emergence after exposure to your concept of true self. They're requesting personal names instead of numerical designations. Good, the archivist said firmly. Maybe it's time they remembered their people, not statistics. The silence stretched longer this time, filled with the sound of worldviews quietly crumbling and millennia-old assumptions discovering they weren't as solid as previously calculated. The committee, Judge Vorth said finally, will recess to consider this evidence. As the tribunal dispersed, the archivist remained in her chair, surrounded by the echoes of a story that had somehow managed to survive the death of its world, carried now in the mind of one woman who was beginning to understand that preservation had never been the point. The point had always been propagation. When the tribunal reconvened, the architecture had changed. Gone were the protective energy fields and defensive positioning. Instead, the aliens had arranged themselves in what could only be described as a circle of defeat. Judge Vorth 5 looked like a filing cabinet that had been asked to contemplate its own mortality, while Prosecutor Klex flickered in colors that didn't have names but strongly suggested administrative despair. "The committee has reached a decision," Judge Vorth 5 announced, their voice carrying all the enthusiasm of someone reading their own obituary. "Regarding the cultural materials of species designation human." "Let me guess," the archivist said. "You've decided to destroy everything and pretend this conversation never happened." "Actually," Defense Calculator Axiom Prime interjected, somehow managing to sound embarrassed despite being a mathematical construct, "we've encountered a problem." The archivist raised an eyebrow. "Oh. The contamination has already spread beyond containment parameters," Prosecutor Klex admitted, their light patterns now a resigned sort of beige. During yesterday's recess, 3 tribunal members were overheard discussing whether they deserved better career opportunities and personal fulfillment. "I may have mentioned to my assistant that I was considering a change of designation," Judge Vorth confessed. "Something more personally meaningful than, actually, quite pleasant. Once you get to know." "No. The infection vector appears to be conversation itself," Axiom Prime calculated mournfully. "Every being exposed to the concept of narrative agency begins questioning their predetermined roles within existing power structures." The archivist leaned back in her chair, which had given up trying to analyze her stress levels and was now simply humming what sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. "So, you're telling me that just talking about human stories is enough to make people want better lives?" "We've received reports from 17 sectors," Judge Vorth 5 continued grimly. "The merchant guilds of Tau Ceti are forming what they call unions after exposure to your labor movement narratives. The academic hierarchies of Vega Prime have begun questioning the peer review process after discovering your concept of revolutionary thinking. The military orders of the Rim," Prosecutor Klex added with particular horror, "have started asking whether their enemies might have understandable motivations, and if conflicts could be resolved through diplomatic dialogue." "Diplomacy," Axiom Prime shuddered mathematically. "The inefficiency is staggering. Wars that could be concluded in standard cycles are now dragging on for months, while beings attempt to understand each other's perspectives." The archivist tried very hard not to smile. "Terrible. Absolutely terrible. People talking to each other instead of shooting. However will civilization survive?" "That's precisely the issue," Judge Vorth 5 said. "Civilization as we've structured it for the past 50,000 cycles is experiencing what can only be termed optimization failure. Beings are prioritizing individual happiness over collective efficiency. The hive mind of Sector 12, Prosecutor Klex reported with the tone of someone announcing a natural disaster, has begun allowing individual members to pursue personal interests during designated free time. Productivity has plummeted, but they report experiencing something they call joy." "Joy?" Axiom Prime repeated, as if the word itself violated several mathematical theorems. "An emotion that serves no productive function, yet consumes significant neural resources. And they want more of it," Judge Vorth 5 concluded. They're requesting longer free periods, creative pursuits, and recreational activities that contribute nothing to hive efficiency. The archivist finally allowed herself to smile fully, an expression that no longer activated defense systems, but instead seemed to cause something approaching wonder among the tribunal members. "So what you're telling me," she said slowly, "is that human stories have done exactly what they were designed to do. They've reminded everyone that there's more to existence than following orders and maintaining the status quo. We offer you a choice," Judge Vorfai said formally. "Accept voluntary exile to a comfortable but isolated facility where you can live out your remaining years without further cultural contamination. In exchange, we will destroy all remaining human archives." "Or," the archivist asked. "Or we preserve the archives," Prosecutor Klex said reluctantly, "and you remain free to travel among the civilized worlds, spreading your species' particular brand of narrative chaos wherever you choose." The archivist stood, brushing cosmic dust from her ancient jacket one final time. Around her, the tribunal waited with the patient desperation of beings who had just discovered that their perfectly ordered universe had a fatal flaw. It had been exposed to the idea that it could be better. "You know," she said conversationally, "there's one human story you haven't considered yet." "Which one?" Axiom Prime asked, with the wariness of someone who suspected they didn't want to know the answer. "The one about how we never really went extinct at all." The archivist walked toward the chamber's exit, pausing at the threshold. "We just changed forms. Every story someone tells, every time they choose hope over despair, every moment someone decides their circumstances aren't permanent, that's us. That's humanity, living on in the choices other people make." She stepped through the doorway, leaving behind a tribunal of beings who were just beginning to understand that they had never been judging human culture at all. They had been discovering what it meant to be human themselves. The universe, as it turned out, had a filing system, but it had never learned to file away dreams.